When they fight without rules, you have two choices: complain or change the game. Most people choose a third option, though they don't realize it. They assume there are rules. Over many years, I have observed workplace disagreements unfold in diverse settings, from consulting sessions and board meetings to private conversations after job cuts. In these situations, the party that ends up losing tends to share a similar internal monologue. They often express sentiments like, "I acted fairly, I didn't initiate the conflict, and my responses were proportionate." These individuals often speak as if the conflict is governed by an unseen referee, presuming that reciprocity is not only a social expectation, but also an inherent law. However, this is often not the case. In the early 1980s, researchers started to explore variations of what they call the ultimatum game. In this setup, one player is given a sum of money and has to propose how to divide it with another player, who then has the choice to either accept or reject the offer. From a purely rational perspective, accepting any offer that is more than zero is better than receiving nothing. Despite this, studies across different cultures have found that people frequently reject offers they deem too low. This shows that people are willing to sacrifice their own potential benefit to penalize perceived unfairness. Later, Ernst Fair provided that people are willing to accept real costs to uphold social norms. This suggests that humans are motivated not just to seek personal gain, but also to enforce principles of fairness. However, there's an aspect of this that is not often discussed, which is that this inherent inclination can be exploited. In disputes, I have witnessed managers intentionally making offers that are almost fair. These offers are not generous or obviously outrageous, but are subtly skewed. This strategy is designed to provoke resentment without being so extreme as to incite open revolt. The person receiving the offer is then put in a difficult position. To reject the offer feels irrational, while accepting it feels demeaning. This system depends on this hesitation. The organization does not need to suppress the individual. It only needs them to comply while rationalizing that they have made a conscious choice. During the financial crisis of 2008, various large institutions publicly defended their bonus systems while simultaneously restructuring, which involved cutting thousands of jobs. The public explanation was focused on shared sacrifice, stating that everyone is tightening their belts. However, internal compensation reports, which later surfaced in court documents and investigative journalism, showed a disparity. Losses were absorbed collectively, while profits remained concentrated among a few. Employees further down the hierarchy held onto the belief that the system, although flawed, was based on reciprocity. This belief was more effective in delaying resistance than any direct threat. I thought of this as hypocrisy, but now I see it as a strategy. Reciprocity acts as a bond in society. Robert Cialdini created a theory around it: giving something, receiving something, conceding something, and expecting something. Research has found this to be very strong, as even small, unrequested favors can increase compliance rates. These studies assume that all parties involved adhere to the same moral principles. But in real conflicts, it is more common for one party to study these principles, while the other simply believes in them. Political campaigns understand this better than many HR departments. Negative campaigning is effective because accusations do not need to be accurate, but they need to incite a proportional response from the target. Should one side distribute 3 negative statements about their opponent over 3 days, the other side may feel obliged to respond accordingly. By the time fact-checking can prove the statements untrue, the narrative has already changed. The tempo is an important factor, but it is an aspect that is not talked about very often in psychology. Consider social behaviors. If someone in a friend group starts to subtly exclude someone, the excluded person may respond with increased warmth. They may assume that there has been a misunderstanding and try to make contact by sending longer messages, offering help as a means to restore the relationship. In the meantime, the person doing the excluding will assess how far they can push the boundaries, becoming silent on one occasion, sarcastic on another. The target interprets these actions as isolated incidents, while the person starts to see a pattern. I do not expect that this pattern is consistent. I have sometimes been in mediation sessions where employees will tell me that they didn't want to escalate the situation. The other side may see it differently as repositioning, information control, or choosing clarity. History provides clear examples. In asymmetric wars, guerrilla movements rarely fight conventional armies on equal ground. They change the terrain, time, space, and choice of target. The conventional army often act based on formal rules of engagement, while the irregular force studies these limitations and designs around them. Niccolò Machiavelli saw this in the 16th century, and he noted that those rulers who stick to virtue in all situations are destroyed by those who do not. However, what is quoted less often is his point about being realistic about people's perceptions. In organizations, mission statements talk about integrity, clarity, mutual respect. On the inside, incentive structures reward outcomes. Here, the misunderstanding of symmetrical conflict can become very risky. If you expect that the other side shares the same level of moral standard, you miscalculate risk. You might reveal your intentions too soon, respond proportionally while disproportion is already in motion, and wait for hard evidence of real aggression while disadvantages build up quietly. The just world idea, which was investigated by Melvin Lerner, shows that people are inclined to believe the world is fundamentally fair or that people get what they deserve. This belief provides societies with stability, but also supports hierarchies. If results seemingly mirror merit, then questioning the rules can imply incompetence. I have watched talented employees burn themselves out trying to win contests that were never designed to be fair. They prepared intensely, documented everything carefully, and avoided political games out of principle. When promotion decisions didn't go their way, they searched for personal flaws. From the perspective of those designing the frame, there is optimization. Here is a pivot. If rules are not universal, then morality stops being a stable foundation and becomes a variable. The stronger side can appear like they have principles. When you expect reciprocity, proportional response, and moral consistency, you anticipate symmetry when entering a conflict. When the other side studies leverage, tempo, and perception, symmetry becomes your weakness. Fairness is not useless, but in conflict, it takes commitment from both sides. The real question is not whether rules exist. It is about who is enforcing them and who is calculating when they can bend them without consequence. If rules are optional, then morality becomes strategic. If morality becomes strategic, the thing to consider is not that others are manipulative. It is that we are predictable. The belief in fairness is not simply a social rule. It is a psychological anchor. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, researchers like Daniel Kahneman, Jack Netsch, and Richard Thaler ran experiments in the ultimatum game, with participants often turning down offers that seemed unfair, even when accepting them would have left them better off. Turning down the offer meant neither player received anything. From a cold, strategic viewpoint, it was unreasonable. From a moral viewpoint, it maintained dignity. I remember reading those reports and thinking that they proved human nobility. Later, I began to see the weakness in it. If I understand that losing is better than feeling mistreated, I could design offers that pressure you into showing your integrity. The fairness bias is not simply about the sharing of resources. It is about identity. In 2008, behavioral economists studied reactions to executive pay during corporate bailouts. Surveys showed that many mid-level workers defended bonus systems that objectively put them at a disadvantage. They claimed that talent must be rewarded and the market decides. These were not senior officials speaking. They were analysts and support staff whose own wages had not changed. They were protecting a system that did not protect them. Cognitive dissonance, which Leon Festinger explained in 1957, explains some of this. When reality goes against our beliefs, we experience confusion. Instead of abandoning the belief that the system is fair, we reinterpret evidence. If I work in a respected place, and that place is unfair, I have two choices: question the place or question my perception. Questioning myself is seen as the easier option. In 2011, Nina Mazar and Dan Ariely showed that people cheat just enough to benefit, but not so much that they damage their image as honest people. Participants overstated performance when they could, but only within limits. They did not focus on profit. They focused on identity. If you translate that into real conflict, an employee might refuse to use office politics, or a business partner might decline to use a contractual loophole because it feels manipulative. I have sat across from people who lost promotions, contracts, and even friendships. What hurt them most was the claim that they should have played the game. Playing the game implied contamination. Defeat was better than self-betrayal. The need to see oneself as moral can override survival. Melvin Lerner's Just World idea showed that individuals are driven to believe outcomes are deserved. Those who observed someone suffering tended to see the victim as the reason for the injustice. It preserved their belief in order. In professional life, the same pattern appears. When something doesn't go their way, many performers search for personal fault before questioning structure. The official explanation is that this belief supports resilience. However, it also suppresses rebellion. I have found something else too. Morality is often framed privately. However, in experiments, the presence of signals, such as a pair of eyes printed on a wall, increases honest behavior. So, when someone refuses to retaliate unfairly, part of what they protect is not just ethical principle, but an imagined version of themselves. In disputes, people understand this better than those who stick to it. They do not see morality as fixed. They see it as presentation. They hold on to virtue while adjusting tactics. Niccolo Machiavelli said that rulers should learn how to appear virtuous while retaining flexibility. I once worked with a senior expert who discovered that a colleague had undermined her in performance reviews. She had proof in emails and timelines. When I asked why she had not escalated sooner, she said, "I didn't want to assume bad intent." By the time she acted, the narrative about her had already formed. She had maintained her moral high ground, but at the cost of her influence. Fairness is a requirement for society. It organizes identity and reduces anxiety. However, needs can be predicted and used. If I understand that you must see yourself as just, I can frame my aggression as necessity. If I understand that you resist looking manipulative, I can push you into clarity. If I understand that you fear becoming one of them, I can make strategic behavior feel like betrayal. The conclusion is that fairness, when unexamined, becomes an advantage. In 2012, when a telecommunications announced adjustments, the internal memo focused on agility. There was no mention of removing positions. Entire departments were dissolved within months. Employees debated efficiency metrics while their reporting lines disappeared. No one declared war, and the frame shifted. George Lakoff wrote about framing in political communication, stating that if you change the frame, it changes what counts as reasonable. In 2003, phrases like enhanced interrogation replaced torture in discourse. The behaviors did not become less severe, but the meaning changed. This is not out loud manipulation, but controlled vocabulary. I have watched dynamics in boardrooms too. A senior official does not say, "We are sidelining you." Instead, they say, "We are consolidating." Jim Sidanius and Felicia Prado argued that group-based hierarchies are maintained not only through force, but through legitimizing myths, such as narratives that defend inequality as natural. Rule breakers respect meetings and circulate documents, but redefine timing. By the time dissent organizes, implementation has started. Timing is a lever of power. In 2018, a firm adjusted its product teams as a cross-functional collaboration. On paper, it increased autonomy. In practice, budget decisions moved to leadership, with frustration coming from the employees affected. Power invites you to participate in a conversation whose parameters are set. Labels increase acceptance rates, as scholars have shown that labeling proposals as the norm significantly increases acceptance rates, even when participants lack data to prove it. Here the mechanism is control of what counts as reasonable. Once we define what is reasonable, any opposition has to justify why it goes against that definition. The person who gets to set the terms of what is normal also gets to decide what actions will cause outrage. People will get mad, but it will only be when certain lines are crossed, and the person in charge gets to decide where to draw those lines. It's not a sign of weakness to stay out of fights. It's a way to protect yourself. When a leader gets other people to argue with each other, they can get everyone to agree without seeming bossy. Studies of how groups make choices, such as Solomon Ash's experiments on conformity, show that people will agree with obviously wrong things just because everyone else in the group does. There are no threats or punishments. It's just the pressure to fit in. Anyone who disagrees feels alone and even silly. Think about how this works in an office. Someone suggests an idea. A few important people support it early on. If others don't say anything, it's taken as agreement. The choice seems to be made as a group. Later, people who are hurt by the choice cannot find one person to blame. There was no mean boss. It just happened at a meeting. I've seen workers blame themselves for not speaking up, but they don't realize that the situation was planned in advance. Key people were asked for their support in private. Worries were dealt with one by one, so they didn't become a bigger issue. By the time of the meeting, it already looked like everyone agreed. Niccolò Machiavelli said that it's better to be feared than loved, if you have to pick one. What people don't quote as often is that he also said to avoid being hated. Hatred comes from doing obvious harm. If you change things without anyone noticing, it's less likely to cause a revolt. If things seem to happen in a fair way, it seems wrong to resist. The smartest ways to control people aren't about stopping them from having choices. They're about carefully selecting the choices available. You can pick any option you want, but they all lead to the same result. You feel like you have a say. You participate, and because you were part of the decision, you defend it. I've even found myself defending choices that actually limited my own power. At the time, they seemed to make sense, like they were the best way to get things done. It was only later that I understood that the logic was based on a way of thinking that I hadn't chosen myself. Power never announces itself, because that would invite people to question it. Instead, it changes the terms. It shifts the words we use, the order of events, and what we expect, until resisting feels like an overreaction. There's no yelling or breaking rules. It's just a slow change in what we think is normal. When control works this way, something strange happens. People follow along not because they're forced or tricked, but because the new situation feels like something everyone created together. If power looks like everyone agreeing, who's left to disagree? If power looks like everyone agreeing, disagreeing feels wrong. And if disagreeing feels wrong, then your own sense of what's right starts to shift. No one wakes up planning to be manipulative. That's just a comforting story we tell ourselves. What I've seen is that it happens little by little. In 1966, Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser did what's known as the foot-in-the-door experiment. Homeowners who agreed to put a small sign in their window were much more likely to agree later to have a big, ugly billboard put on their lawn. The second request was way out of line, but the idea of being consistent had already taken hold. Once people think of themselves as helpful, they tend to keep acting that way. This study is often used to teach marketing tricks, but I think it shows something else. Getting into morally questionable actions usually starts with something small, like a sticker. Think about the big corporate scandals from the early 2000s. At Enron, internal emails showed that workers were questioning the company's accounting methods. They weren't shouting, just asking questions. The first changes to how things were reported were small and seemed okay, presented as new ways of doing things. Special companies set up for specific purposes, ways to keep debt off the books. It was complicated, but legal, or so it seemed at first. By the time the numbers were being actively faked, the culture had already become used to bending the rules. No one went from being honest to committing fraud overnight. The line was crossed little by little. I've talked to middle managers who took part in choices that they would have condemned years before. They don't see themselves as villains. They talk about pressure, monthly goals, competition, what investors expected. I had no choice, they say. This phrase shows up in meeting notes, memoirs, and quiet talks after everything falls apart. It sounds like an excuse, but sometimes it's just a way to feel better about what happened. Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance explains why people do this. When what we do doesn't match what we believe, we often change what we believe to feel less uncomfortable. If I bend a rule once, I start to think of the rule as something that can be bent. If I don't say anything when a decision seems wrong, I start to think of not saying anything as being professional. Each step makes us feel a little better, and each step makes the next one easier. In practice, it's not as simple as the theory suggests. It's messier and more human. A purchasing manager once told me about changing how suppliers were evaluated after talking informally with a supplier they preferred. The changes were small, adjusting the importance of different factors by a few points. There was no clear reason to exclude other suppliers, but the preferred supplier just happened to score higher under the new system. When I asked if it felt dishonest, she paused and said, "It's just strategy. Everyone does it to get the best results." That word, optimize, has replaced manipulate in many fields. Optimization sounds neutral, scientific, and necessary. Manipulation sounds personal and intentional. But if you change the system to get the result you want, what's the real difference? Being selective about the truth is another subtle shift. In negotiations, It's normal to not share everything. No one expects you to be completely open. But there's a big difference between being strategic about when you share information and being deceptive. A founder trying to get investors might talk up the company's growth potential while downplaying any problems. The problems aren't denied, but they're not talked about much. If someone asks about them later, the founder can say, "We mentioned that in the appendix." It's technically true, but it's also misleading. I was surprised by how often people use plausible deniability to protect themselves emotionally. It lets them keep a good image of themselves while still benefiting from being unclear about something. As long as they don't lie directly, they can still feel okay about what they're doing. Personal betrayal works in a similar way. In long-term relationships, whether romantic or professional, boundaries disappear little by little. A secret shared just this once. A small lie told to protect someone. Staying quiet when something is misunderstood because correcting it would be awkward. Each action is small enough to justify. Over time, trust breaks down not because of one big betrayal, but because the line has moved so far that the original standards seem unrealistic. In 1974, Stanley Milgram talked about his experiments on obedience and how increasing the voltage in small steps made extreme behavior possible. Participants didn't start by giving the highest level of shock. They increased it little by little. If they had been asked to give the maximum shock right away, most would have said no. Increasing the shock gradually made it seem like a continuous process. They weren't monsters, they were just being consistent. This sense of continuity is what makes it dangerous. In corporate crises, internal investigations often show that there were early warning signs. Small problems, questionable incentives. But dealing with them would have caused trouble, and people don't want to cause trouble. So they stay quiet, thinking we'll fix it internally, or there's no need to make a big deal out of it. By the time it's impossible to fix, the damage is huge. From the outside, it's hard to understand how smart people could let things get so bad. But from the inside, it feels like each step is small and almost reasonable. People rarely abandon their principles completely. They just change how they interpret them. Being adaptable is seen as a good thing in leaders. You should be flexible, practical, and adjust to the situation. These are valuable qualities, but if you're too adaptable without having strong principles, you can lose your way. When the only goal is to get results without considering how you get them, being morally flexible can give you an advantage over others. This is where the conflict gets sharper. If your competitor is willing to bend the rules, take advantage of unclear situations, and stay quiet when it benefits them, then refusing to do the same can feel like you're hurting yourself. But if you adapt too much, you lose who you are. When does being strategic become manipulation? There's no alarm that goes off, no clear point where you cross the line, just a series of justifications that start to sound smoother and smoother. The most dangerous manipulation isn't what someone does to you. It's what you tell yourself to explain it. When I had no choice becomes a common excuse. When everyone does this sounds like a fact rather than a defense. When it's just strategy replaces thinking about what's right and wrong, the line has already moved. And because it moved gradually, you might not even remember where it used to be. If your own sense of what's right and wrong is flexible, who decides where it stops? If it's flexible, someone else will eventually test how far it can bend. And they won't start with threats, they'll start with leverage. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment from 1963 are still disturbing. Not because the participants were cruel, but because they were hesitant. They were sweating, asking questions, and looking at the person in the lab coat to see if they should continue. When they were told it was okay, Most of them did continue, not because they thought giving the shocks was right, but because the situation made disobeying feel unsettling. The person in charge didn't need to punish them. They just needed to make continuing seem legitimate. That's the first problem with the idea of being in control of your own actions. Compliance doesn't require agreement. It requires pressure that feels structured and justified. In corporate hierarchies, this pressure is rarely obvious. A manager doesn't say, "Do this or you're fired." Instead, performance reviews become unclear. The criteria for promotions shift subtly, and opportunities to work on important projects become limited. The message is in the air. If you fit in, you're safe. If you resist, you're taking a risk. I once saw a company reorganize where the senior leaders talked a lot about open dialogue. Employees were encouraged to share their concerns in meetings. Some did, but within months, those same people found themselves left out of key projects. There was no official punishment, and their performance reviews were still good, but the invitations stopped coming, and their influence decreased. The message was clear, even though it wasn't written down anywhere. Fear of being excluded is one of the most powerful ways to control people. In 2001, Kip Williams and his colleagues did the cyberball experiments, which showed that even being briefly excluded from a virtual game of catch caused measurable distress. Participants who were ignored for just a few minutes reported feeling worse and less like they belonged, and they were more likely to conform in later tasks. The brain sees exclusion as a threat, and the body reacts as if survival is at stake. Think about how that works in the workplace. When a colleague realizes they're no longer included on important emails or asked for their opinion, they feel it physically. Their sleep patterns change, their attention wanders, and they start to adjust their behavior to be included again. They volunteer more and soften their disagreements. No one ordered them to comply. The possibility of being excluded was enough. Fear of losing status works in a similar way. In 1968, sociologist Harold Garfinkel described status degradation ceremonies, where people are publicly demoted. Modern organizations do quieter versions of this. A job title is changed, reporting lines are adjusted, or an office is moved. Officially, nothing is wrong, but everyone notices. Status anxiety is contagious, and observers learn that stability depends on fitting in. I was surprised by how much more powerful uncertainty was compared to injustice. Studies on job insecurity during economic downturns, including research after the 2008 financial crisis, showed that employees were more stressed by not knowing whether their job would exist in 6 months than by a clear decision. When the future feels uncertain, people are more willing to prioritize stability over fairness. Being financially dependent makes this even worse. In fields where healthcare, visas, or retirement benefits are tied to employment, disagreeing can have serious consequences. An engineer on a work visa might know that a company is doing something unethical, but they stay quiet because leaving would threaten their legal status. A single parent in a volatile market might put up with an exploitative boss to avoid losing their income. It's not that they're morally weak, it's just a matter of survival. People in power understand this. Reputation also plays a role. In tight-knit professional communities, being known as difficult can spread faster than being known as competent. I've seen managers subtly label dissenters in casual conversations, saying things like he's brilliant, but not a team player, or she's a strong performer, but resistant to change. These phrases are rarely written down, but they circulate, and the person senses the shift before they can figure out where it's coming from. It's often about hesitation. Power doesn't need to crush you. It just needs to make you pause long enough to think twice before acting. A delayed email, a second thought before raising a concern, a decision to wait for a better moment that never comes. Each hesitation makes the problem worse. The darker truth is that breaking the rules works not because people don't see the injustice, but because instability feels more dangerous than unfairness. Injustice can be justified, but instability threatens your identity, income, and sense of belonging. When someone is trying to get leverage over you, they don't look at your principles, they look at your dependencies. Who signs your performance review? Who controls what you have access to? Who shapes your reputation? And which relationships you can't afford to lose? The more tangled you are in these things, the less force they need to use. I've seen talented and ethical people go along with decisions they secretly opposed, not because they were convinced it was the right thing to do, but because openly resisting would have unpredictable and wide-ranging consequences. They told themselves they would push back later, when the situation was better, but later rarely came. Being in control of your own actions is a neat idea, but in reality, it exists within a network of obligations. Once you understand how fear, leverage, and invisible pressure work, you have to ask yourself, if compliance is driven more by fear and dependency than by genuine belief, then how much of what looks like loyalty is really just managed fear? If much of what looks like loyalty is actually managed fear, then try to fight back within the existing structure is already putting you at a disadvantage. You're arguing within a system that's designed to contain you. That's when you need to change your approach. For a considerable period, I hesitated to engage with Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince beyond a surface-level reading of historical cynicism. It's tempting to dismiss it as a mere collection of immoral instructions rather than examining it as a diagnostic tool. The Renaissance trappings aside, we find not a doctrine of cruelty, but a treatise on structural realism. Machiavelli's focus isn't on the appeal of evil. It's on the necessities of survival within unbalanced power structures. Machiavelli grasped a principle that current organizational psychology often misses. If prevailing rules prevent success on a level playing field, simply complaining about fairness isn't a viable plan. Instead, one must reshape the environment itself. Consider, for example, political actions that have altered entire systems without direct confrontation. The United States' 1972 opening to China, orchestrated during Richard Nixon's presidency, wasn't motivated by a shift in shared moral values or even the perceived value of trade. Instead, it fundamentally reshaped global power dynamics. By establishing ties with a former adversary, the United States redefined the strategic landscape of the Cold War. Rather than intensifying the battle on existing fronts, it changed the map, rendering existing battles obsolete. While critics focused on ideological concerns, the Nixon administration worked to shift international leverage. In the business world, similar pivotal shifts are evident, albeit often less conspicuous. Netflix's transition from a DVD rental service to a streaming platform in the late 2000s is an example. Netflix disrupted its own business model before its competitors could do so. Instead of directly competing with Blockbuster on the terms of physical distribution, Netflix wholly reimagined how content was distributed. While many subscribers were initially resistant, doubting the service's reliability, by the time other companies responded, the groundwork had shifted. The battle was no longer about retail presence, but instead was about digital infrastructure. The element that intrigues me isn't this spirit of innovation itself, but the psychological strength required to abandon an arena in which one is comfortable. Most tend to prefer optimizing their standing within the current parameters. Altering the rules of engagement feels risky and perhaps even a bit disloyal. Machiavelli cautioned that change-makers should expect resistance from those who maintain an advantage under the status quo, while only receiving tentative support from those who stand to gain from a new arrangement. This observation is not mere theory. I have observed mid-level leaders attempting to challenge counterproductive performance review systems within corporations. They would present data, cite employee satisfaction surveys, and suggest small adjustments. Yet, resistance came not just from the upper ranks, but from their own colleagues who had learned how to succeed under the existing system. Altering the structure would threaten their well-worn coping strategies. Therefore, altering the frame must come before confrontation. In negotiation research, academics have illustrated how reframing the central issues can produce radically different results. Often, when parties transition from positional negotiation to a framework based on shared interests, impasses dissolve. Yet the most valuable application of this is more subtle, such as, for instance, if raising salary is not an option, try shifting the discussion to expanding the scope of the candidate's influence or authority. If controlling the budget is not possible, then change the criteria for measuring success. Manage others' perceptions before taking any actions. I have encountered professionals who escape career stagnation by not outdoing their rivals, but by reinventing their role entirely. An operations manager, for instance, found herself blocked from promotions due to established hierarchies, yet she strategically repositioned herself as the point person for cross-department coordination. The title change didn't occur right away, but the change in her professional network did. Within a year, her sphere of influence had grown far beyond her original rank. She stopped vying for acknowledgement in a limited field and expanded her scope horizontally. Retaliation became too costly, as her removal would have disrupted various units. This principle usually remains unarticulated. Don't allow yourself to be drawn into a contest on your opponent's ground. For instance, should a contest be framed as one of devotion versus disloyalty, the dissenter will almost certainly lose. Yet if it is reframed as risk management versus prioritizing short-term gains, the scenario shifts. Suddenly, resistance becomes a display of prudence instead of an act of rebellion. Another useful method is to appear predictable, but act with asymmetry. People in the corporate world who show that they are stable and balanced often obtain greater leeway to make strategic, quiet moves. They don't openly show their desires. They show stability. As a result, when they take a new position, it appears logical instead of destructive. I never thought that how a person is viewed would so often occur before he or she gained power. In political races, framing establishes how particular behavior is viewed as either boldness or recklessness. A candidate who is labeled as pragmatic can make radical policy changes under the guise of being practical. The same move would be called radical if it were made by a candidate seen as someone who supports ideology. To manage the way others see you before taking action is to make those actions valid. Demanding a high price for retaliation does not involve aggression. It calls for interdependence. Create alliances that extend across divisions. Have a variety of ways to be seen by others. Put contributions in writing, but don't make judgments on them. The greater the amount of connections you have with people, the harder it is for isolation to occur without causing significant harm. None of this requires one to forsake their morals, but it requires one to be aware of the makeup of the whole. To change the current situation is not to lie, betray others, or unfairly exploit the situation. It is to be aware that the rules came from people that already are the recipients of advantages. If you agree to keep things as they are, you agree with their shortcomings. Machiavelli's truth about life makes one think because it does away with ease. He gives no promises of fairness. He tells how things are. Once you understand the nature of those things, innocence becomes a choice. It is here, however, is where disagreement arises. If you do well in making the situation different and learning how to manage impressions and take advantage, it could lead to your becoming what you stood against. The change that protects you also sets you apart. This leads to important questions. Once you've learned to make changes, who is accountable to ensure that you are not the one whom others need to deal with so they can exist? If you gain skills in making the situation different, overseeing impressions, and demanding a price for acts of retaliation, it will start a subtle change. You gain the upper hand. You gain space. You gain sway. After that, you start to always watch for risks. This price is rarely discussed when talking about strategy. A research done in 2014 on burnouts of top dogs, which was published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, studied top dogs working for companies located in many countries. The study found that emotional fatigue was the primary reason, instead of just what one had to do that led to burnouts, which was related to consistently staying watchful. Top dogs who communicated high amount of acts of backstabbing in their organizations also communicated having less trust with people and higher levels of stress. It wasn't the stretch of time that one was awake that caused strain. It was the feeling that everything that happened had a subtext. Strategic detachment requires having no emotions. One starts valuing conversations not for their capability to produce connections, but for what one can get out of it. Who sides with whom, who is slow to answer, and who uses your own wording. As time passes, relationships become tools. Useful, dangerous, interchangeable. I have seen top-level managers slowly make their circle of real friends smaller. In the beginning, it is easy. Share less, show less, maintain power over purpose. Afterward, it happens on its own. Even easy remarks are filtered. Humor is intentional. Keeping quiet can be used as a tactic. The traits of being observant and strategic takes the place of openness. Here, theory can give answers, but it can't give ease. Research on power completed by Dr. Keltner suggests that power can lower sympathy levels. People possessing high levels of power will interrupt more often, they don't listen closely, and they misinterpret one's feelings when measured against those in lower positions of power. Cognitive load is usually the given reason. I'm not sure that's the only single reason why. Whenever you are trained to see opportunity, that opportunity becomes increasingly apparent. People turn into numbers. Loneliness occurs. After famous scandals took place, a lot of chief executive officers have told of being separated not just during moments of crisis, but far before them. Coworkers started to be careful. Friends turned into advisors. All words of praise felt strategic. All criticism felt increased. The more power that was held, the more the channels of honest feedback grew smaller. I never thought how fast control would cause suspicion. Political psychologists looking at different governments throughout the 20th century have evidence of a trend in the profile of one with authoritarian leadership. As leaders gain power, they clear out those closet to them again and again. People have to be loyal, but it is always subject to question. Advisors are switched around, sidelined, and replaced. Being paranoid isn't just something disordered. It occurs because it takes place in a situation where betraying someone is valuable. When you're conscious of how manipulation occurs, one makes the assumption that others are knowledgeable as well. Even in less sensational environments with corporations, a constant state of alertness can change who you are. I once talked with a creator who had done better than people trying to compete over a decade. He had seen many wins. However, he said that he no longer found happiness in talking casually. He predicted when people would disagree before they said it. Being neutral equated to hidden opposition in his world. Being aware of strategy had turned into general unease. Trust slowly dissolves in that place. Lower-level associates find there to be a disconnect. They react by speaking in ways that don't commit to much. The leader takes that lack of commitment to validate that it is crucial to keep careful. A feedback loop creates itself. Both sides find opportunity in being strategic. Fairness shrinks. The contradiction is brutal. The greater control you possess, the less secure you feel. That is because increased control means increased amount of responsibility, increased ways in which you can be seen, and increased chances of being exposed to others. All choices have the openings for others to feel upset. Being in an alliance is to be against another. Behavioral economics shows that those who have lost something feel the pain with greater feeling than making an equal gain. At higher marks of power, chances of loss become more real. Fame, titles, impact. The fear of failing to keep what one has gathered can eclipse the feeling of satisfaction felt by having it. Strategic focus, after one takes it on, can be difficult to stop. If one has learned how to see frames, relationships, and influence, it translates over to friendship, to family situations, and to easy conversations. One starts to cast doubt on motivation automatically. That watching will protect you. It also will hurt the ability to be spontaneous. There's also who one becomes. If one regards themselves as strategically skilled, seeming like one is at risk feels insecure. By admitting ambiguity, one could seem like they're getting in a lower position. As time passes, the amount of feelings one has narrows. It's not due to a lack of having feeling, but for showing it seems to come at a steep price. I have found in organizations that some of the most skilled at getting around politically rarely go through situations out in the open where conflict occurs. They stop it from occurring. They expect it. They avoid it. However, many have reported weariness not from struggling, but from being in a state of constant calculation. Machiavelli's realism didn't promise a sense of calm inside oneself. It promised lasting and stable situations in quickly changing situations. Having been adapted to recent times usually forgets what it will cost. When reframing, managing the way others see you, and finding ways to put things in your favor is done well, one might protect themselves from being taken advantage of. One may even shape situations to their favor. But they also agree to consistently be alert. Being alert for years will change character. With all the above stated, having power is not just a positive thing. What must one give up in exchange? If strategic coolness protects you from being misled, yet over time drives you away from trust, what exactly has been protected? Furthermore, if the system supports individuals who can withstand that deterioration, what message does that convey about the system itself? If alertness reshapes personality, the next uneasy question that must be asked is, can one assign accountability to the one that made a world of alertness to be justified? It is tempting to lay blame on a person's character, to speak that some are just more dishonest, more ruthless, and more Machiavellian. Yet the moral framing started to have openings after I began to follow how corporations, political campaigns, and digital platforms all matched. The behavior we described as manipulation is many times forced upon us due to the structure of the thing itself. Look at how bonuses are awarded within corporations in the early 2000s. At Enron, salesmen were given rewards on short-term profits, not on keeping profits for the long term, not when managing risk. Quarterly gains were converted directly to compensation and titles. Internal memos were later brought to light, which showed that revenue achievements were recognized, addressed jokingly, and were even admired. The system didn't put requirements on those to be fraudulent. It rewarded people who could curve the accounting principles without being caught. Those who hesitated were dropped to the side. Those that made the first move were awarded. This is something that happens a lot. In studying behavior in economics, tournament theory details how not all rewards will be allocated to those at the top, which can intensify one's willingness to take a risk. When only a small amount of top dogs get rewards beyond the measure, actions change based on these changes. To go along is not a priority to doing better than others. If curving the standing practice improves the chances of going where the rewards are the greatest, the system selects those that curve the practices. I used to have the idea that this was about greed. It's more like the ways things are. In 2011, researchers looking at Wall Street traders found that increased levels of testosterone matched being more risking and higher profits in a short amount of time. That rise also made gains volatile and caused losses over time. Companies did not consistently punish things like volatile behavior, so long as there were visible gains first. The system amplified what was seen. Any type of risk that couldn't be noticed was someone else's problem later down the line. Things in politics echo those traits. For example, look at making strategies in political races when using algorithms to get your message to a larger crowd. Studies that looked at patterns found on social media showed that touching emotions spreads quicker and further than talking about neutral policies. Being beyond reason spread further. Breaking it down to where parts were not included performed better than being nuanced. The systems didn't openly accept manipulation. Their algorithms rewarded being passionate. There is a turning point in the reasoning if you're a political race strategist who's able to view this data. Does one keep still and have the chance of not being seen? Or do you polarize, simplify, and evoke emotions? The structure determines the choices selected. Game theory predicted this a good while back. In experiments done time and time again with multiple prisoners, being cooperative can come about under secure and clear conditions. If there is asymmetry, seclusion, and one-time social interactions, defection rates increase. Reputational results become weak, and one's self-interest begin to lead them. People haven't become different genetically. The matrix for payment has. Things in theory show how uneasy this is. Most disagreement aren't between those who are good and those that are bad. Differing rates of ability to operate through strategic discomforts is what causes these. I have viewed middle-level managers not wanting to accept credit for a college job, even when it could be inferred that they took it. They opposed it inside of them. The counterparts took the account that wasn't theirs, portrayed themselves as if they had done the work, and moved forward. 3 times after promotions, those who stole credit had positions in high roles. The first group saw themselves as behaving ethically. The second stated they were being realistic. Which one was the system that received the most rewards? Social media gives a diluted likeness of the story. On platforms like Facebook and X, early users who mastered outrage and controlling the narrative gained followers immediately. Content moderation practices lagged reward-based reasons for a number of years. Those who had a higher acceptance of ambiguity, like sharing headlines that were misleading, making inflammatory strings of words for others to see, gained visibility. Those who demanded to verify moved slower. Algorithms measured what was clicked and not what was right. An average user felt that stress at a personal level. If one posts something balanced, it falls quickly. To post something cutting, fault-finding, and stirred with emotion, one will watch it climb. It is easy to learn what is desired. It is the reason why individuals' behavior feels substandard. It goes without question that there are personalities high in Machiavellian characteristic studies done by Richard Christie and Florence Geis in the 1970s had that construct recognized. When all industries show similar ways to behave, personality cannot be the only reasons why. Systems give rewards to those who make the first move. When markets become more reasonable to compete in, those who make the first move capture the ears and lock down things being told. Just envision the technology companies that change what it is before rules can be made to catch up. The underlying structure is in place once the oversight arrives. Operating in grayer areas comes as a strategic benefit. They give rewards to those who are able to control what one can see. By the time there is work done in crisis communication, the start of the frame of the event will influence what the reader thinks. A prior reason gives something to secure oneself to. There is momentum for those who can accept not being truthful about the complete picture. Systems give rewards to those that can handle moral ambiguity. The thing is that one will spend a disproportionate amount of their time hesitating. Time is leverage in situations where there is a lot of competition. I wasn't expecting how little malice was required from each. It is often strategic alignment. A young consultant at a multinational firm once opened up to me that she no longer brought up matters of being ethical when pitching to clients after seeing coworkers being referred to as not commercially minded. The comments were barely noticeable, never moral, oriented more to career. She became accustomed to it. Not that she had less values, because she saw that it would cause careers to move forward. The relationship between the cost to oneself, as discussed previously, is meeting the structure. If being alert melts away trust, and the system is constantly showing that being alert is rewarded, then the loss of trust becomes a justified act. The problem is not of villains being in control, is rather that incentive structures silently select for those at ease with operating in discomfort. Those who can withstand intellectual incongruity, narrative distortion to where it is justifiable. And for everyone else, employees, voters, users' experience becomes confusing. They sense that there was acts of deceit transpiring, but are unable to locate the single reason why. They see their incentives, deadlines, metrics, engagement dashboards, and results from the polls. Are individuals dishonest? Or do frameworks give credit to being dishonest? The precise question should read, what kind of person is most likely to keep going in environments where making adjustments to acceptable behavior is profitable and moral hesitation is slow? And if systems promote that type of persona, can there still be shock at the result? After becoming aware of the structure, the situation is under new terms and doesn't belong exclusively to those acting. It is the property of the one that defines the rules, that shows a change on the war grounds. If frameworks target and select those who can withstand ambiguity, one is unable to respond with disgust and surrender. Something must be done at a conscious level. I held back from speaking on that for some time. It sounded abstract. However, patterns will become something concrete when shown the data from studies completed from conflicts that have asymmetry. A negotiation analysis completed at Harvard in the 1980s showed that when something had a trust that the meeting was cooperative and the another saw it as reasonable to compete, the cooperative sided conceded quicker and were more available to given information. The determinant from the result was the asymmetry, not the acts of aggression. Trajectory was determined from the one that was able to conclude a thought rightly. Recognizing the asymmetry early in the situation is not showing cynicism. It gives an understanding of things happening. I have viewed project managers not rightly understand in-house competition at large-scale firms as coordination and teamwork. What came from a project manager during a preliminary review shared strategies, putting crucial interactions, made weaknesses known. Months later, those project managers would find themselves dropped to the side, with thoughts having someone else's title. When asked what was the reason things went in a direction that was not intended, people would say that it was betrayal. The thing is, by nature, they had come into a competition setting while saying things from a helpful view. Having an innocent nature starts to lose its value. It believes in symmetry. It believes on the rules. Experiments that came after Robert Axelrod's tournaments in the 1980s, doing prisoners dilemmas, often showed that the top strategy was not just helping with no end, or that people would just refuse permanently. If one was not treated fairly due to lack of clarity, what was done would be reciprocated, when a counterpart then gives help. There weren't any feelings that led to it. There was no ruthlessness. It was conditional. It split people apart. That separation is important, to the degree that people will mix their feelings with the rules for acting. I am truthful, therefore I share it. I am fair, therefore I concede. The way that someone feels and doing are not the same. A state's attorney can be committed to fairness and still choose when it is the right time to say evidence. A CEO can value being upfront to people and still take the appropriate amount of time when opening disclosures. Strategy isn't destroying morals, it is sequencing. Those things are rarely said out loud. Consider the times facing crisis communication. During the Tylenol cyanide crisis in 1982, Johnson & Johnson framed it as a state of affairs that caused concern about public safety versus a product recall for narrow reasons. They had charge of getting the word across before people made unshakable reasons of facts. The recall was the most far-reaching and expensive, yet the title had been restrained as the word being relayed was definitive. They did not wait for accusations. They had done this by defining the situation at the start. Compare and contrast those scandals to when leaders of a business delayed on accepting results because they hoped that points would get better. There are multiple cases that could be said when companies had skewed financial reporting in the early 2000s. As outside events took control, efforts within began to lose impact. Controlling what can be seen as conflict increases. It's not about being sneaky and deceiving. It is to prevent distortion. Is it about being helpful? The meaning of ethical leverage gets people upset because it can cause someone to think of manipulating. What leverage means to one is not harmful, just to be less being dependent on one another. Ways in which income is made that are diversified. Agreements that are in written form. Communication being clear. When starting business or people start to speak about payback, they depend on who they trust. People making and sealing equity in writing builds impact without being aggressive. I remember advice from an originator who could feel as if he was taking advantage by those who invest during moments of time when things are going badly. What he consented on had wording that lacked clarity in belief that they would be trustworthy. Later on, The terms of closing erased his title. He tells about it in the way in which it was a personal act of treason. When reading, it came into alignment with what had been sealed in the contract. He had morals to hold to. One of the other sides had the ability to be impactful. To build means that one must foresee that the playing book will not be balanced so that harm will be prevented. But nothing stated can work unless one can define what they have an obligation to be. The nature of how people behave show how easy it can be to be boundaryless under pressure. When having to put forward something and do some acts, that's what Experiment from Dan Ariely from the early 2000s said. A lot of those put slight distortions to what they thought without doing anything really wrong. What's done piece by piece? It is important to decide on your obligations, or the place of being will decide for you. To be fair, one will only do one time, or just so that it can hold on. When executives insist, they'll say they would deceive who's putting up money. Then, put simply, leaving something out is being prudent. Selectively disclosing information is using strategy. In that situation, theory is unable to protect people. Strategic awareness can become a strategic rationalization until you have made specific boundaries that must be upheld. The end is that how do you not become emotionally cold? It is about becoming thought out and being premeditated. Be aware of where relationships are not symmetrical early, so that competition will be caught and can't disguise itself as cooperation. Separate the persona and way of behavior, such that the values guide you for ends, not when using strategies rigidly. Take charge of getting the story across so that competition does not increase. One must also manage perception and keep it from running from how things really are. Be ethically impactful. One never has to be cornered into making moral compromises with no space for disagreement. Understand the obligations before there is pressure and things are tested. When there are not rules, you do not have to get rid of your morals. Just have to get rid of ideas that are not real. You will not become uncompassionate. Become conscious and aware. Realizing what goes on has the capacity and strength to change the rules to the game. It is above just aggression. I keep attention in mind. After having insight in the ways in which structures hold up, also understand the incentives and how some relationships could not be equal. You cannot disregard what was stated. Every encounter has payments that are hidden, and everything that is collaborated contains potential divergence. It is not the risk of getting exploited. It is that the place of alertness increases. When did taking measures to be strategically alert can protect morals, and when did having it can the people who perform to be changed quietly.